This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you're tuned into When Science Speaks. Thanks so much for being here. Today's episode is brought to you by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists and engineers get funding, gain influence, and build relationships with the stakeholders who matter most in their professional environment. It is wonderful to have Dr. Melanie Kitzan on the show today. Melanie is Associate General Counsel and Head of Science and Innovation Management at the Allen Institute in Seattle, which was created by the late Microsoft co-founder Paul G. Allen to unlock the complexities of bioscience and advance our knowledge to improve human health. Prior to her work at the Institute, Melanie took an elected career sabbatical for a year, during which she volunteered with North Cascades National Park, mentored startup companies founded by women and persons of color, and began work on a book about female solo travel, among other meaningful pursuits. Before her sabbatical, Melanie served for 10 years at Invention Science Fund as a portfolio manager in counsel and business development. She began her professional career as a patent attorney at two prominent law firms in Seattle. Melanie earned her Ph.D. in genetics, cell biology, and molecular biology at University of Nebraska Medical Center, her J.D. from Lewis and Clark Law School, where she was named Best Oralist in the Moot Court competition, which we're going to get to a little bit later, and her B.S. in biology from the University of Minnesota. Welcome to the show, Melanie.
Thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you have the special distinction as the first lawyer scientist who has been a guest on the show. So thank you for that. And I'm going to ask you sort of straight away what you see as similarities and differences in the way that lawyers approach their work compared to scientists.
Well, I would definitely say there are a lot more similarities than differences because both are very problem-solving based careers. I think scientists usually get to approach more elegant problems than lawyers do, but we both have very problem-solving oriented perspectives. And because of that, we have to approach those problems in a very analytical way. So we have to piece together information that we get for a bigger picture based on all of these sometimes random pieces of information, or else we have to tease apart a very complex problem one thread at a time and try to figure out how this really works or how we really got here. So I think that's a very common approach to both. I would say both require passion to be really good in order to sustain yourself in that career. Science is based on experimenting, of course, trial and error, but so is law. We call it practice because, of course, we sometimes receive guidance from the law, but we don't really have a lot of specific details for a particular problem that we're solving. So I think those are both very common to both careers.
I really liked how you described that, both, taking these disparate strands and putting them together, or taking apart this jumble of thread and trying to make sense of it. That was really, really vivid. And I have never actually heard that description. Thanks for sharing that. And it kind of leads to my next question, which is, scientists, as you know, are trained to follow the data, so to speak, while advocacy is at the core of being a lawyer. So as a lawyer and a scientist immersed in such a dynamic environment as the Allen Institute, that's, dedicated to basically solving the biggest problem that we have, how do you operate effectively with within various prominent cultures?
Yeah, they actually fit together quite well in my experience. Having that sort of shared core passion for science, really lets me connect with the scientists about their work. And then for me, it's just sort of telling the story around the science and the data as we piece that in, either with contracts or patent applications, however it might be. And so in some ways, it would be a way to think, we have shared characters, and we just change the context or the scenery around that. And so I think that's, and again, it requires that sort of curiosity and ability to listen to the information and be able to hear each other in sort of coming from that data collection point, but also from the passion. And how do we tell that story together? And how can I help support that science and that mission is really at the crux of most of our conversations.
Yeah, really interesting. Let me ask you about this, the different language perhaps. Do you find yourself sometimes kind of translating, because you speak the native language both of the law and of science. And so, having both of those things, having that understanding, is sort of like maybe when talking to a scientist, you're almost thinking along with that person, in his or her own terminology, and sometimes having to translate that into the legal environment.
Yes, absolutely. I think, having it's sort of a mix and a balance of the art and the science, as it were, in order to be able to obtain that sort of data and information, and then put it into a different context of that legal environment. And I guess getting back to your other question about differences, I would say the biggest difference between sort of the scientists and the lawyers is that in this translational process, the scientists are generally much more optimistic and the lawyers are much more pessimistic. And so, the scientists want to make advances in the knowledge and make the world a better place and increase our understanding. And then when lawyers come in, it's sort of the rain on the sunny day, right? We say, okay, this is great, but what would happen when things go sideways? What happens if this doesn't work out? What happens if there's a performance issue or a staffing issue or a funding issue or anything that could, make something go wrong for us? Then what? And it makes the conversation a little bit rough sometimes, because the scientists want to get on with their work and they believe in what they're doing and they believe that everything will go really well. And it only takes one sort of sideways situation for them to really appreciate the value of the lawyers who plan for those rainy days and maybe have those provisions in the contracts to protect them or to sort out and resolve a conflict that might arise later.
That is really, really insightful. I appreciate you talking about that. And then you see it both ways.
That's right. And I can celebrate and say, this can be a beautiful wedding day and you can have the cake and the flowers and all of that, but we also have to plan for a divorce just in case.
Right. I wonder if you could share a story about when there was tension between these two dimensions that was strictly, particularly striking to you. Of course, protecting the innocent with, in any way you're comfortable doing, but maybe to illustrate specifically the type of situation that you're describing.
Well, I would say that, I spent a lot of time in my career sort of breathing the life into the technology for my own advocacy of the clients that I've represented, whether it was once I represented a small therapeutic company that was interested in pursuing a product line that had been sort of cast off by a larger biopharma company. And it was a bit of a David and Goliath story. The biopharma company just saw it really as a liability issue. They didn't really want to pursue anything around that product line. But my client was a scientist who had been working on this particular product and was very committed to it and felt very strongly that there was still potential there. So we really had to sort of go in and it was definitely not so much of a factual or data-driven decision. It was very much an emotional decision to allow sort of this potential therapeutic to carry on, and frankly, this particular scientist's dream to carry on. And those are sort of the stories that when there's a conflict, even though the law and science are very factually driven and very data driven, oftentimes the decisions do hinge on emotion, which is sort of that interesting concept. And I would say that even with more recently now at the Allen Institute, our mission is to drive impact and every deal that we do, every partnership, every collaboration is really driven and focused around what is our scientific impact. And if there are tensions high or conflicts that arise in any of the dealings, we always come back to that center point. What is our impact, and how will this further that mission? So it's very much an emotional sort of end game, as it were, even though everything that we deal with is very factually based.
I love it, and I love how you made that connection and shared that particular story, because you can really feel that kind of tension that you were discussing, and like the irony of, well, a lot of these come down to emotion, even though this is all based on data, is something that is really important for everyone to hear. I talked a little bit, you chatted a little bit about translation, and you're being at the crossroads of that as both a scientist and as a lawyer. A major challenge that faces many scientists is actually, how to translate the complexity of their work into accessible, engaging terms, while of course maintaining accuracy and not dumbing it down. And so I would love to I'm going to turn back to your award again as best oralist in the moot court competition, which is a very big deal during law school. And so I, wonder if there are tips that you could share on how, to achieve this feat, making the complex both comprehensible to non-experts and also compelling.
Yeah, fortunately, my mind naturally processes in analogies. And so I try to walk through the details with clients about the particular situation, and then I'll draw sort of a broader brushstroke to something analogous that everyone can relate to and sort of appeal to in a communication way on more intuitive level. And then we can walk back to something that's more specific. So for example, if I explain inventorship to a group of scientists, I might talk about describing baking bread, and the one who originates that recipe and is the inventor, and the one who maybe is just following that recipe and baking the bread is not usually considered an inventor. But if the bread were to not work out, maybe the bread flops, and the baker has a great idea about what could have gone wrong and what could have been done better, and saying, we really need to swap out baking powder for these eggs because that's just not working, or maybe we need to make this a yeasted recipe instead. Well, then that role of that baker changes, and that position then can become an inventor. And so it all depends on, who does what and how that sort of thinking and that process comes to be. But that is, the whole essence of inventorship, which is a very sort of complicated legal concept, but on a very intuitive level, people almost always understand it when it's explained in a way that everyone is familiar with. And so I try to take steps like that to really employ common situations, or if there's a contract that maybe we're confused about, or there was a misperformance step, I'll say, well, this is similar to if you hired someone to mow your lawn and that person came and painted your house. So then what would we do? And so people understand it on an intuitive level, and then we go back to the details of the situation.
Yeah, that's so great, and thanks for those real world, in your reality kind of examples. The power of the analogy and the metaphor, starting with something that is relatable to everybody, so important. I want to shift gears a little bit, because thinking about relationship building, that's something that many grad students and PhDs and postdocs are told about, the importance of building relationships. And I wonder, as a scientist, or as an attorney, however you want to kind of look at this, or both, whatever, in your professional world, how you've experienced the value of relationship building, and what are some of the keys that you've found to developing productive professional relationships?
Sure. I think this is an area that can especially be hard for scientists. I know it's hard for me. I tend to be a natural introvert. And so I don't golf. I don't go to social events if I can avoid them. And so I think for a lot of scientists that's true. But yet I've made some of, my deepest friendships from graduate school and the time that I spent in science. And it is a small world. And I think, it's very important now, looking back. If I were to do it over again, I would encourage anyone starting out in their career to really seek out mentors, especially. I think as we proceed and go, it's hard to really find your way just through your own experiences. If you have
Mhm.
someone to help guide you, it can shave so much anxiety and questions and doubt off of your own experience.
Mhm.
And for me, I was the first woman in my family to go to college, and I didn't really appreciate what it meant to sort of seek out others' experiences or to even try to leverage that for my own
Mhm.
career success. I just sort of thought, well, you go out there in the world and you work hard and you do what you do, but people really do want to help each other. And
Mhm.
I spend a lot of my time now at this point in my career reaching back to mentor startups, to
Mhm.
mentor folks who are really struggling in ways that they may not even be aware of. And if I could help them out, that's very fulfilling for me. So I would just be, messaging to your audience, really take some time to reach out to others. It may be a little uncomfortable, or it may feel a little outside your comfort zone, but those relationships are really valuable and very fulfilling for people. So I think I value those more and more the older I get.
Mhm. Mhm. And you touched upon something too, Melanie, is that if people ask you or our prospective mentor, that person may kind of be looking for opportunities to give back and feel really fulfilled by being the mentor. Not something that many times we think about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, everyone's busy and we always see it from our side of we don't want to intrude or we
Mhm.
don't want to ask something of someone who may already have a very busy calendar. But it is something that people do enjoy. And I think, especially for me, when I was starting out in the early 90s in my career,
Mhm.
there weren't a lot of women in positions in the institutions where I was. And there weren't a lot of women who were able to do full-time positions at all. And so trying to balance sort of career and family and all of the requirements
Mhm.
really was not as available to women, I think, as it is now. And I really didn't have a lot of options to seek out mentors that were
Mhm.
sort of like me, or someone that I could really feel like I could connect with. So I think, do that in any way that you can, and do it for yourself, and know that someone else would probably really appreciate being able to share that with you as well.
Thanks so much for bringing that forward, Melanie. And I want to ask you as we wrap up, with your PhD dissertation in immunology and the active role that the Allen Institute is playing in various aspects of COVID-19, including why some people who are infected don't survive and others do. Would you like to share your perspectives generally on the current status of efforts to understand and we hope inoculate against the virus?
Yeah, this is just been a fascinating and devastating, frustrating time, I know, for the world. And it's just, there's such a tremendous amount of energy and effort being put into the understanding this virus and its various strains and the epidemiology, the transmission around it. Of course, complicating those situations as they are, make it very difficult to pursue a vaccine that could be
Mhm.
safe and effective, which are the gold standards for any vaccine. And of course, vaccines are basically just little suitcases that carry, a certain piece of the virus that we're planning to mount an immune response to.
Mhm.
And then they usually have an adjuvant that will amplify that immune response just to make sure it's effective.
Mhm.
And, there are several efforts underway to do that. I believe there are 5 or 6 companies at least that are in active clinical trials. And being able to move forward with vaccines that I believe they're wanting to just do a single dose now and see what can happen in a single dose,
Mhm.
because oftentimes vaccines will need multiple doses to be effective. But I think, the best reports I've read so far is that, the expectation would probably be around Q1 of next year, of
Mhm.
2021, to be able to get something that is approved, and it's fast tracked through the FDA. There is an emergency use authorization that the FDA can use to sort of short track the process, because a standard process for vaccines can take years by the time
Mhm.
it goes through all of the clinical trials, and then of course the good manufacturing practices that have to be put in place in order to manufacture the vaccine so that it's widely available.
Mhm.
And as it looks now, some of these first data could come back from the trials in the next few weeks,
Wow.
and it could be set up for approval probably by early next year. And depending on manufacturing, I would expect by mid to late next year, it should be widely available to folks, at least in the U.S. And it's kind of a double-edged sword for vaccine companies, because obviously there's a push and a race to see who can get to market fastest. But at the same time, there's a product liability of that. They definitely don't want to overstep any data points or any quality measures, because you do need to have a very safe and effective vaccine. And certainly if there's one that gets to the market that's not both safe and effective, that will further erode any sort of public trust in any vaccines that could come later. Not to mention, again, the liability that company would face if it's harmful or not protective. So the manufacturers and the developers of these vaccines, I do believe, will take good measures in doing that. Their own reputations are at stake. They're certainly not in this business to do anything except help people. So I do believe that the processes will be carried out as best as can be, given the circumstances.
I think in that one answer, you combine both your scientist and your lawyer personas. So I appreciate that, because I actually going to ask a follow up on that. You talk about liability protection. I worked on Capitol Hill for a long time, as you know, and something industry always wanted was protection from liability. Blanket protection is usually the adjective that is put in front of it. And if FDA say uses their emergency authority, and this is all fast tracked, and then there are, and probably, realistically speaking, it's probably inevitable that some people have negative reactions. Hopefully, if that happens, it won't be severe negative reactions. But from a company perspective, it's sort of like, look, we were participating in this program. They probably got a lot of federal money, to do this quickly. And, a lot of the steps had to be skipped. Then sort of like, in exchange, like, shouldn't we be given blanket liability protection in case something goes wrong? Otherwise, we have this huge risk, for example, risk exposure.
Yeah, it is a bit of a risk exposure, and it is. That's why I mentioned the double-edged sword. Everyone wants to be the first vaccine in the market and to have that advantage, but at the same time, you certainly can't skip fundamental steps, or you do open yourself to risk. And so, I don't know if there will be some negotiations happening with those companies, but hopefully they can proceed. And of course, every trial has a data and safety monitoring board that oversees it, and that's sort of the ethics guide for the trial, and they can decide if something becomes unethical, if there aren't enough trial participants, or if it's not clear enough that there's a really safe and effective outcome. So hopefully we would be able to see that prior to any FDA approval, and that should help to reduce the risks of anything that would be incredibly negative coming out of the vaccine once it's approved.
I can say that if I were at one of these companies developing a vaccine, I would want to be the second company to market, not the first. So, Melanie, thank you for bringing your unique perspective, these great, specific stories, bringing both your Ph.D. scientist persona with you, and also your counsel and science management aspect of what you do. Really a unique blend together, and sharing that with me and our listeners today.
Well, thank you, Mark. I really enjoyed the conversation.
And listeners, thank you so much for being with us on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.